File into the bunker and take your seats. The broadcast is about to begin. From Fort Bragg, North Carolina, this is the Doomsday Clock. Stories from the brink of Armageddon. Brought to you by the 18th Airborne Corps.
Welcome back to the Doomsday Clock. I am Christal Crawford here with Joe Pacino.
How are you? Episode 3. We're still on the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's right, and we have a special guest with us today, Michael Dobbs, author of the book 1 Minute to Midnight.
Yeah, we're about to get Michael Dobbs on the phone here. Michael, if you don't know who he is, he's done some great scholarship around this story. He's visited Cuba. He's talked with some of the Soviet leaders there, talked to some of the Cuban forces there. He's dug up some archives. Really a phenomenal historian. He was born in Belfast, Ireland, educated at University of York. He's got fellowships at Princeton and Harvard. He was a reporter for the Washington Post. He spent a lot of his time as a foreign correspondent, and then he started writing about this period, really about the Cold War. And 1 Minute to Midnight is, in this country, really the foremost work of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Absolutely, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say, and I hope you all are excited as well.
Let's get him on the phone. We walked through this in a previous episode. Michael, Castro comes to power in Cuba 59, Kennedy's elected in 1960, and we talked last episode about the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Can you just briefly describe how we get from the Bay of Pigs to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how one almost leads to the other?
Right. Well, the Bay of Pigs, of course, was a total disaster from the American point of view. It failed, but the Kennedy administration was still determined to get rid of Castro one way or the other. So actually, after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, then the emphasis shifted to internal subversion. There was an operation called Operation Mongoose, which was managed by the president's brother, Bobby Kennedy, which aimed to subvert the Castro regime from within. And that was also, pretty much of a fiasco. They underestimated the strength of the Castro regime, but what it did do was to alert Castro and his Soviet protectors that the U.S. wanted to overthrow the Cuban government one way or the other. So it was the worst of both worlds in a way. It was it both failed on its own terms, but it also alerted the other side that they needed to take some kind of defensive measures. So that was the reason, or one of the reasons, why Castro agreed to the deployment of Soviet nuclear weapons on his territory, and a reason why Khrushchev felt it necessary to send nuclear missiles to Cuba, which he'd never done before, anything like that. So there's a direct link between the failure of the Bay of Pigs to the beginning of Operation Mongoose, the sabotage operation, and the Soviets' sending of nuclear missiles to Cuba, which, of course, triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And the plan for Cuba, the American plan, is there's some parallels to D-Day here. Massive airstrikes followed by a ground invasion.
Yes, I mean, I've looked, the plans for this operation are all in the National Archives in Washington, and I've been through them. And as you read them, it's very familiar to anyone who's with any knowledge of D-Day. They were planning a landing on beaches. I've been to those beaches in Cuba, and I've been to the beaches in Normandy, and they're actually very similar. So they were going to land 8 divisions, about 120,000 troops, along a 40-mile front from the port of Mariel to Tarara Beach, which is very similar, actually, to the D-Day landings. And on top of that, they were going to parachute airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, to 4 airports in the Havana area, including the main international airport. Actually, the D-Day landings, there was also an airborne component. So the plan was very similar to the D-Day plans nearly 20 years before. But of course, the world had changed since D-Day.
That's right. The world had changed in a lot of important ways, and I think the technology in some other ways hadn't fully advanced. So, one of the really fascinating elements of the book to me is just the kind of the paradox between the power we had to evaporate large portions of humanity and the lack of technology to communicate our intent with that power. So, I think as a descriptor, one of the better scenes and the best scenes in the book is when, I believe it's Kennedy, most powerful man in the world, is trying to get in touch with Hale Boggs, the Democrat House Whip, another one of the most powerful men in the world. And Hale is fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. In 1962, there's no way to call him. So the Pentagon drops him a literal message in a bottle. That kind of dichotomy seems like it almost led to a disaster.
Right. I mean, that's very true, I think. I mean, we're caught between two eras now. In 1962, we're caught between the era of the Second World War, which, of course, the military was very familiar with, and the era of modern communications. Nuclear weapons, and the difference, of course, was that each side now had the power to blow the other side up to annihilate the world through a nuclear exchange. So the difference with the Second World War is that both the U.S. and the Soviets possessed not just strategic nuclear weapons that could target the heartland of the other side, they also possessed and were planning to use battlefield tactical nuclear weapons that could be used on the battlefield. But the United States intelligence, during the run-up to the missile crisis, they detected the weapons, the missiles that could hit the United States. What they didn't realize was that the Soviets on Cuba were also equipped with tactical nuclear weapons that would have been used against an American invasion force. So these men that were planning a D-Day type landing in Cuba in October 1962, these troops might have been confronted with the use of nuclear weapons for which they were completely unprepared.
Right. And those Americans are led by a cavalryman, Hamilton Howe's, commander of the 18th Airborne, who's going up against another cavalryman, Issa Plyayev, the Soviet commander of ground forces in Cuba. Which cavalryman had the upper hand? It sounds like Plyayev.
Well, eventually I think the United States could have prevailed in a invasion of Cuba, but there wouldn't have been much left of Cuba, and there wouldn't have been much left of the U.S. invasion force. I mean, eventually the U.S. obviously had the superior forces, but this could easily have escalated from a local nuclear exchange to a exchange between the two superpowers, which of course is very alarming. I think studying this period, what we were looking at was the early stages of a nuclear war, the very early stages. I mean, the Soviets had nearly 100 tactical nuclear weapons on Cuba, including very primitive cruise missiles and missiles known as frogs, which could have been fired from were mounted on armored vehicles and could also have been fired at a U.S. invasion force. But most of this, the Americans were completely unaware of.
So, Michael, in your book, Plyayev, in some ways, was a laughable figure. His troops didn't take him too seriously, and he was, in some ways, completely unsuited for the position in which he found himself.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't he wasn't part of the nuclear command. He was a trusted political general. He was quite a cautious person. So he wasn't a wild man at all. the nuclear, of course, Soviet nuclear forces were very much an elite within the Soviet military, and the people who controlled the nuclear forces, particularly the strategic nuclear forces that could reach the United States, I mean, they were separate, or they were sort of operated in parallel to the conventional forces commanded by Pliev. But I think, one of the problems in October 1962 was what Joe referred to earlier, which was the sort of rudimentary communications. It's very easy to imagine circumstances in which individual Soviet military units on Cuba lost communications with their high command, Pliev, and Pliev lost communications with the Politburo headed by Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow. So in those days, it was not like nowadays when, there are strict controls and locks over any kind of nuclear weapon, whether it's tactical or strategic. In those days, the command of a tactical nuclear unit actually fell to the captain or major who was in command of it and was physically able to fire these weapons without authorization or approval from Havana, let alone from Moscow. So in the event of a U.S. invasion of Cuba, I think this is the most dangerous element of it. It's not that Khrushchev would have ordered a nuclear attack on American forces, which would have been suicidal, or even Pliev, but that in an event of a U.S. invasion, ground invasion of the island, that communications would have been disrupted, and these captains and majors would have been forced to take decisions on their own. And I've talked to them. I went and met with many of them in Moscow many years later, and they said that in the event of an invasion, they would have defended themselves with whatever weapons they had available to them, including nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and it is amazing that we avoided catastrophe. There's misperceptions, there's bad assumptions on both sides of this, and really, for one thing, the Soviets were at a great disadvantage in terms of missile capability. You point that out in the book. If it comes to a shooting war,
right. In terms of strategic weapons, the U.S. had overwhelming nuclear superiority. And this is one reason, actually, why the Air Force commander, General LeMay, felt that this was an opportunity to win a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. The Soviets had put more emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons, and I think this is, we didn't realize at all during the most tense period of the Cuban Missile Crisis that the Soviets had these tactical short-range weapon systems with nuclear warheads that they were prepared to use in the event of U.S. invasion. I was horrified to discover that on October the 26th and October the 27th, some of these tactical nuclear missiles were moved up to the periphery of the Guantanamo naval base. And so Guantanamo would have been one of the targets in the event of a U.S. The implementation of these D-Day type landings that we talked about. At the other end of the island, there were Soviet captains and majors who were fully prepared to wipe out Guantanamo if they were called upon to defend themselves.
So what were some of the major flaws, aside from the lack of understanding or the lack of knowledge about tactical nukes? There's also a lack of knowledge about the volume of Soviet troops in Cuba. What were some of the bad assumptions the Pentagon made here?
Well, at different times there were different estimates of the number of Soviet troops in Cuba, but on October 26th, it was assumed that the Soviets had between 6,000 and 8,000 troops on Cuba. In fact, they had more than 40,000 troops on Cuba at that time, including 3 combat regiments and as well as these nuclear units. So the U.S. was, really prepared to face down or take on the Cubans, but they weren't prepared to take on the much better armed and efficient Soviet force that was actually on the island.
And so if you play out the hypothetical scenario, the sort of fantasy/nightmarish scenario, old plan 316 goes into effect, strategic bombing followed by airborne assault with simultaneous amphibious assault. What do you think happens?
Well, it's very difficult this is called counterfactual history, and it's very difficult to imagine what might have happened. It might have all gone well, and the Soviets wouldn't have used their nuclear weapons, and the U.S. invasion would have been successful, and the Castro regime would have fallen, and the Soviet nuclear sites would have been captured. That is one possibility. But the other possibility is that it will all have gone terribly badly, and that the local Soviets, either with the authorization of Moscow or without the authorization of Moscow, nuclear weapons would have been used on Cuba, which would have escalated to a strategic nuclear exchange between the two superpowers. I mean, I perhaps would give it 50-50 which way it went, but 50-50 is not very good odds for fighting, being ready to fight a nuclear war.
Yeah, absolutely. And for folks of my generation, Christal here, we know how it ended. We know how this was resolved by Kennedy and Khrushchev. Not all of our soldiers do, and not everybody in the country does. Can you just kind of walk through the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, there was a lot, of course, that Kennedy didn't know about what was really happening on Cuba, and a lot of the intelligence he was getting was faulty. But he did understand that he had he'd fought in the Second World War in a very junior level. He was a lieutenant junior grade out in the Pacific, the captain of a patrol boat. But that had given him a sense that, in war, all bets are off and things can go terribly wrong. So that experience, he carried with him that experience into the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he understood that he couldn't control everything, and neither could Khrushchev, and the time was running out. So in the end, on October the 27th, which is known as Black Saturday, when many things along this nuclear battlefront were spinning out of control, both Kennedy and Khrushchev, for their different reasons, understood that they had to bring an end to this crisis. So essentially, Kennedy accepted the offer from Khrushchev that the U.S., that the Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba, but in recognition of that, the U.S. would withdraw its intermediate-range missiles, its analogous missiles from Turkey, which had actually become obsolete by that time, and it would agree not to invade Cuba. But the part about the U.S. withdrawal of the intermediate-range missiles from Turkey was to remain secret because, this would have been a blow to NATO. So the Kennedy brothers insisted that part remains secret. But the rest of the, this implicit bargain that was struck in October 1962 remained in force. And that was what really averted the crisis. And as a result of which, the Castro regime remained in power in Cuba. I mean, the real winner of this, paradoxically, was Fidel Castro, because although he was furious with Khrushchev for pulling the missiles out of Cuba, in fact, the U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba. It didn't invade Cuba for another 40, 50 years. And Castro remained in power for another 40 years and finally handed over his power to his brother, Raul, who remains in power today. And that was the end result of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And just to maybe put a cap on this really fascinating period and this conversation and your book and the idea of how we understand the Cuban Missile Crisis. In popular culture, Kennedy is the hero, at least in this country. That this was the golden jewel of national security decision making and crisis management. How much of that is sort of myth making by maybe the Kennedys after the fact, and how much of that was things sort of lucked out for Kennedy, and how much was this his keen understanding of the situation?
Well, I think that he was the hero in the sense that, he avoided the worst, and I can easily imagine that we would have been in a completely different situation with a different person in the White House. It could have ended very differently. So I think that both Kennedy and Khrushchev, although they made plenty of mistakes, they were both heroes in that they navigated this, the most serious crisis of the nuclear age. But it wasn't quite the same way. It didn't happen quite as it was depicted in the early accounts of the missile crisis. I mean, because we didn't know for many years that the U.S. had agreed to withdraw their missiles from Turkey, this seemed a much more unambiguous, clear-cut victory than it actually was. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a victory because Khrushchev was forced to withdraw his missiles from Cuba. But it was, it was also more of a compromise in the end because the U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba and to pull out similar missiles from Turkey. So I think it was a victory for common sense rather than a victory simply for the United States.
Well, we want to thank you for your time and really thank you for your scholarship here, the book, 1 Minute to Midnight, and really been following your work. And just thank you so much. Looking forward to your Richard Nixon book, King Richard?
King Richard will be out next May.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you, sir. Thank you. Take care. See you. Bye. Well, that, Christal, was our discussion with Michael Dobbs. Fascinating interview.
Very much so.
And, next episode 4, is going to be our final piece on the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're talking to another historian, Dr. John Bonin, and we're just going to talk a little bit more about the tactical plan. And we look forward to talking to you on episode 4.
Outstanding. Looking forward to it.
All right.